Yes, hello to you all once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and as you can see, we've moved outdoors once again, and today we're here at North Carnduff Farm in Strathaven, which is just a few miles from Glasgow, to cover round 3 of the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club's 2023 Championship. Now this track here at North Carnduff Farm is basically your old school type of racetrack. No big fancy berms or jumps to contend with, just a nice flat open plan type of racecourse. But the weather here at North Carnduff is absolutely fantastic, as it has been of course for most of the week here in Scotland, so hopefully as the day progresses, dust won't be too much of a problem by the end of the meeting. Now we do have classes here for the pre-1968 vintage bikes up to the pre-1975 machines, and of course quite a good collection of twin shock or pre-1984 race bikes as well. So there's plenty going on here at North Carnduff Farm. So without any further delay, let's take our usual walk around the paddock and try and take a look at some of the nice bikes that are soon to take part in this round 3 event here at North Carnduff Farm. Okay, so let's start with a quick look at a couple of very nice bikes from Billy Pentland, and this is Billy's 1975 Montessor 250 Capra, one of 2 Montessors that Billy's recently added to his collection, but it's still quite an original example, and is still fitted with a lot of the bike's stock parts, although bits and pieces including the handlebars and some of the controls are maybe not from that time period. But these Montessors are quite a rare bike to see at vintage and classic scrambles these days, but back in the early 1970s, these Montessors and a few other European bikes, including Bultacos and Ossas and Maicos and a few others, were the staple diet for your average motocross racers. That was of course up until the Japanese then flooded the European market with their much better Yamahas, Suzukis, Kawasaki's and Hondas, which of course then led to many riders just selling off their European race bikes in favour of the much better quality and cheaper Japanese brands. But our little 250 Monty appears to still have its original beater piggyback rear shocks, which were also used on the Spanish Bultaco bikes of that same period. Now, maybe not the greatest suspension units to fit onto an off-road bike, but as I keep saying, this was the suspension technology of its day. But it certainly wouldn't take too much to put this little Montessor back to its stock original condition, because most of its 1975 parts are still intact, and Billy said that he has another identical bike to this in the process of construction. So he's a very lucky lad to have 2 of these very rare bikes in his possession. And so this is Billy's other race bike, which is a YZ490 Yamaha that's been altered from its original monoshock rear suspension to a twin shock rear end, so that Billy can race it alongside the older twin shock machines. And because it has the air-cooled motor, drum brakes on the front and the back, and it now has that all-important dual twin shock suspension setup on the rear, it now qualifies to race in the twin shock category. Now naturally a bit of re-engineering was required to change the rear suspension setup from its stock monoshock original configuration, and most work, it has to be said, was done on this alloy swing arm, which had to undergo some major surgery to allow it to accept a shock on either side. But when the work was all completed, Billy was very happy with his engineering, although some of you YZ 490 purists out there might scoff at why anybody should cut up a perfectly good alloy swing arm to put old school twin shock suspension units on it, but it appears that the finished product works superbly well on the racetrack. But most of the rest of the bike was more or less left untouched, although the original Yamaha side panels were swapped for a pair of substitute panels from a 490 Michael. But as you'd expect with that big 490 Yamaha two-stroke motor sitting in the chassis, this is still a quick bike on the track, and even without its factory single shock on the rear, it still has the looks of a bike that could turn heads when those twin shock suspension units are sticking out each side. But a very nice pair of race machines from Billy Pentland. Now the next bike that I spied on my walk around the paddock was Rob Wilson's quite nice looking CR480 Honda, a machine of course that needs no introduction, as its story and achievements have been well documented down the years, but an absolute rocket ship of a bike that had the looks and power to match. And to ride one of these ballistic missiles to their full potential, you certainly had to have cojones the size of tennis balls if you wanted to try and tame one of these puppies. Now the heart of the big 480 was this reed valve two-stroke motor, which, as I remember, I think had a 5-speed gearbox if it's a 1983 bike, and I think these motors were pushing out around the 52 plus horsepower mark, but just a simple alloy box section swing arm here on the rear with Honda's Pro Link suspension system as well. But certainly not a bike for the faint of heart, and certainly not the kind of machine for a little dawdle around the racetrack at the weekend, because these 480s certainly liked to be ridden fast and ridden hard. And the great racing legend Danny Magoo Chandler was one such superhuman who could make these things fly, and it was a joy to watch him take one of these 480s by the scruff of the neck and pass everything on the track. But this example here of Rob's is a lovely looking bike, and you can see this machine and many more like it in action on the track when I post the racing highlights from this round 3 event, which will be coming very soon. Now you certainly can't have a paddock walkabout without bumping into an old Myco or two, and this 1981 490 Mega 2 belongs to Ronnie Craig, and is another fine example of one of these legendary iconic twin shock race bikes. Now Ronnie's one of the Myco faithful, and he's been quite loyal to the German Myco brand for most of his racing career, and it's not surprising really when you consider how good a bike these were in the early 1980s, and even now here in 2023 they're still as popular as ever, with good examples still fetching top prices. And if you want an idea of just how quick these bikes still are, then again check out the racing highlights in my next video posting. But once more, the beating heart of the mighty Mega 2 is this awesome 490 two-stroke power plant, which compared to a Japanese equivalent motor is maybe not as well engineered, but nevertheless like for like in terms of their performance. These piston port Myco motors were every bit as powerful as any of the big 4 Japanese manufacturers. But certainly a decent set of Olin's piggyback shocks on Ronnie's Michael, which are a much better upgrade to the standard suspension units that Michael fitted onto these bikes in 1981. But the Michael engineers certainly got their calculations spot on when they designed this chassis in that year, and since then various other manufacturers have tried to copy its dimensions and parameters, but as yet they haven't come up with a viable replacement. But certainly a very nice example of the mighty Michael from Ronnie Craig. Now, during my Paddock walkabout, the next bike that I came across during my stroll was this 1977 RM 125 Suzuki that was about to be raced by Duncan Libby. Now, quite an original looking little bike again, even although it has different handlebars and maybe non-standard shocks on the rear, but as I remember, these 125 two-stroke motors were very good little engines, and I'm sure that they had a bore of 54mm and a stroke of 54mm also, but it still had a reed valve intake and a 6-speed gearbox with your usual oil-cooled wet multi-plate clutch as well. And the sparks for the motor were supplied by Suzuki's PEI, or pointless electronic ignition system. Although overall these 125 RM Suzuki bus bombs were good enough little bikes for their day, because they did have a decent tubular steel chassis and this 125 two-stroke motor to push it along, and your left leg was always kept very busy dancing up and down on that 6-speed transmission. Now, these air shocks are of course not right for this bike, as it would have been a simple pair of conventional dampers that would have been bolted on at the factory in that year, but these Vintco suspension units are basically your Fox air shocks under a different name, but American made of course, and quite simple in their construction. But I still can't help thinking that Duncan should have opted for something a bit more conventional to keep the rear of his little Suzuki in check. Now, Duncan did tell me that he got somebody to paint this fuel tank for him, but not to the standard that he required, so he says he's going to get it repainted at a later date. But I must say it's still quite good to see one of these little twin-shock Suzuki still being raced on the track, because you virtually never ever see these older RMs still taking part in vintage racing nowadays. But this late 1970s example of Duncan's is still a nice looking little bike, and it wouldn't take too much effort to put it back to its original standard condition. Now, if you're looking for unusual and rare bikes, then this is about as good as it gets, and this very unusual specimen here was brought along to race at this round 3 event by Raymond Road. Now, I know that you're all just sitting there waiting for me to tell you all the juicy details about this machine, but I'm sorry to disappoint you, because I know absolutely nothing about this bike. Now, I did try and gain some background from the bike's owner, but there appeared to be a little breakdown in the language barrier between the two of us. But I do remember the word Latvia being mentioned, but whether that was the origins of the bike or where Raymond actually came from, I'm not entirely sure. But looking at this motor, which appears to be a single cylinder twin-port two-stroker, and it's certainly not a Jawa or a CZ engine, as my guess would be that it's some kind of Russian road bike that's been made into a scrambler, because I certainly recognise that carburettor, as I've seen one of these on those Russian-built Minsk motorcycles in the past. But it's for sure a weird and wonderful looking machine, which was actually signed up to take part in the race event, although for some strange reason unknown to myself, it didn't actually take to the track in any of the racing on the day. But it certainly is a most unusual looking motorcycle, and I'm not sure if that plastic cable tie is holding the carburettor onto the airbox, or the airbox is keeping the carburettor in place. But maybe my more knowledgeable YouTubers might recognise this logo on the fuel tank, which I'm sure is some kind of Eastern Europe manufactured bike from that part of the world. And once again, on this rear mudguard, more interesting logos, which I'm sure somebody watching will immediately identify the bike's origins. But having two of these low-slung silencers might make you think that it's some kind of Jawa or CZ bike, but I'm pretty sure that it's neither of those, and I'll stick with my original assumption that it's some kind of Russian-based motorcycle, which looks like it's been a road bike at one time, where somebody's just added a set of knobbly tyres and then put some high-level mudguards on it to try and make it into some kind of full-blown off-road machine. But certainly looking at this motor makes you think that it's not been too heavily engineered, and in a way it looks almost agricultural in its design. And it still looks like the rear of this bike will do quite a lot of hopping around with these basic dampers on the back, so it's maybe best to just try and avoid any big tabletop jumps until such times as these get upgraded to something a bit more substantial. But don't let it be said that I don't bring you some of the weird and wonderful off-roaders from around the globe, and certainly this machine qualifies on both of those counts. Okay, so next up it's a quick look around a few of the nice bikes that Andy Mallock will be racing at this round 3 event at Strathaven. And this first machine here is just one of 2 Spanish Montessors that Andy's brought along. So this featured bike here is his 250 Capra that Andy will be racing in the pre-1984 250 class. And again, as you can see, a nice original example of one of these European Spanish Montessors. Again, not a bike that you see nowadays still taking to a racetrack, but before all of the Japanese bikes came to Europe in the late 1970s, these Montessors were widely used around the UK. And on the right there of your picture, you can see Andy's other Montessor, which is a 414 Capra model. But as I said, both of these bikes, the 250 and the 414, are again good original examples from the early 1980s. Now, Andy's third twin shock racer is his old CZ bike, which he'll be racing at some point in the day's proceedings, but he's going to be racing in 2 different classes on the day, so Andy's certainly going to be a very busy lad between racing his 2 Montessors and this old CZ as well. But when you take a look at the racing highlights from this round 3 event, you should be able to see Andy either riding his Montessors or whizzing around on this old CZ. But certainly a nice trio of twin shock racers there from Andy Mallock. And so next up, it's the turn of Brian Aird and his lovely BSA Victor, which Brian has owned and raced for quite a good few years now, but sadly he's telling me that he's now letting it go and is offering the bike up for sale. But as far as I know, the bike has a BSA Victor chassis with the B44 four-stroke motor, which I believe has been bored out to about 465, and inside the engine it has most of the usual BSA engine refinements that you usually find on these old four-stroke motors. Now, the bike's rear suspension units are a pair of good quality rock shocks, which do allow a little bit of scope for adjustment to the rebound and damping. But certainly this B44 motor has been well maintained down the years, and Brian told me that if this engine ever needed anything, then it got it, regardless of the price. But naturally, if you need all of the information and specs about the bike, then it's probably best just to give Brian a call on this number, where he'll tell you every little detail about what's been done on the bike down the years, and more importantly, of course, the sale price of the bike. And again, as you can see, your standard BSA alloy fuel tank there with that locking Montessor style fuel cap there on the top. Now, the tank is, as you can see, painted in this orange coloured livery, which I'm pretty sure is just a personal choice of Brian's. Now, he did tell me that this steel swing arm is a Terry Weedy manufactured part, and also on the back of the bike we have the traditional CZ rear hub, which is quite common on these old Victors, because we also have a CZ hub here and brake fitted to the front as well. But certainly a lovely old classic, and quite quick as well on the track, as I've watched this bike many times down the years, and Brian has won plenty silverware and podium spots during that time. So if you're looking for an old British classic to have a bit of fun on at the weekend, then why not just give Brian a bell on the number that we just previously posted. Okay, so next up it's another nice Honda CR250, and this example here is Jim Greaves' chosen weapon for this round 3 event here at Strathaven. Now, I'm pretty sure that this is a 1983 model with that water-cooled reed valve motor sitting in the chassis, but again another quite good example of one of these very quick Hondas from the early 1980s. And as I remember, these CR250s had quite a good, strong and agile chassis, but that liquid cooled 250 engine was just a peach of a power plant that gave a good spread of usable power throughout the entire rev range. And in terms of its power output, this 83 250 was said to be one of the best 250 motocross motors available in that year. And as you can see, Jim's bike has had a replacement D and G expansion chamber fitted, which isn't unusual for a motocross bike of this age. And at the back end it was just a pretty basic alloy box section swing arm as well at the rear, backed of course by Honda's excellent Pro Link suspension system. But another fine example of one of these very quick CR250 Hondas. But as you can gather, there was quite a good variety of German Maicos on display at Strathaven, and this nice pair of 81 490 Mega 2s are Alan Bott's two race bikes that he'll be racing in the pre-1984 class. But Alan is certainly up there with some of the top twin shock riders in the country at the moment, and he frequently races both of these 490s at many of the big twin shock race events that take place around the UK. And it's probably fair to say that Alan's a Michael fanatic when it comes to these open class 490s, because he has quite a few examples of these German-made motorbikes at home. And in fact, he also has a couple of Michaels in storage in the USA, which he brings out to race when he flies over to the States when the racing season finishes in the UK. So not only is he kept busy during the British summer, he's also racing during the winter, when most of us have our own bikes neatly tucked up for the long winter duration. And so, as I said, please try and not miss out on the racing highlights if you want to see Alan strut his stuff on both of these bikes, because if you ever had any doubts at all about how quick these 81 Mega 2s were back in the day, you'll certainly be able to get a glimpse as to why these 490s are still regarded as one of the best open class twin shockers ever made, when you see them ripping around the racetrack here at this North Carnduff Farm at Strathaven. Now this was another nice looking Michael that I came across during my Paddock walkabout, and this 1978 or possibly even a 1979 440 was Darren Brown's chosen race bike for this round 3 at North Carnduff Farm. Now it's said that if you can't get your hands on a nice 1981 490 Michael as your chosen race bike, then these 1979 440s are certainly a very good alternative, because they do have quite a similar chassis geometry to the 81 bike, and they also handled very well. And as far as this 440 piston port motor goes, I can certainly vouch for this engine, because it's identical to the motor that I had in my old 1980 Michael twin shocker. But 1979 was of course the last year that Michael used these alloy tanks on their motocrossers, as they then made the switch to plastic fuel tanks in 1980. But this is still quite a nice original looking bike, which still has many of its stock factory fixtures from that year, but it's still a steel rear swing arm, and of course that alloy waver thin brake backplate that always looked like it was made from a Coke can because it was so thin. But our 79 bike is certainly showing signs of track battle damage on this expansion chamber, but these Michael seats always to me were very comfortable when you plumped your backside down on them. And as I said, these 79s were a much better bike than the 1980 model that would follow, because they did handle so much better than the 1980 bike, and in my opinion were much better looking as well. But another nice looking old German Michael there from Darren Brown. Okay, just to conclude our Paddock walkabout at this Scottish Classic Round 3 event, we're going to finish by taking a look at another rare Michael from 1984, and this example here is Morris Wharton's lovely SC 250. Now Morris did tell me that this bike originally came from the USA, and in its past life it had very little in the way of racing on the track. So as you can see, it's still in great condition for a bike that's nearly 40 years old. But these liquid cooled 250 micro engines were said to be pretty good by all accounts, and I think they had a bore of about 67mm and a stroke of around 70mm, and the fuel delivery was by way of a 38mm Bing carburetor that was fed through a reed valve into the cylinder. Now the transmission was by way of a 5-speed gearbox and an oil-cooled gear-driven multi-plate clutch, but as I said, further day these 250 two-stroke motors developed a decent amount of power, and they were also reasonably reliable. But these SC Micros were still fitted with a steel swing arm in 1984, and this particular SC even still has its original wheels and spokes, which is quite rare because normally on a bike this age it would have had maybe a new set of wheels, or even had the old ones rebuilt by now. But as I said, you don't see many of these SCs in this kind of condition these days, let alone still see one racing on the track. And all of the bikes' plastics are still the original items, and they still look almost brand new. But as I remember, the SC in the bike's title was an abbreviation of Supercross, as I'm sure that this was the target market when Micro exported these bikes into the USA. But again, another very nice example of one of these SC250 Micros from Morris Wharton. But just before we go, we also learned some very sad news at this Round 3 event about the passing of another Scottish Classic racer, Callum Wilson, who was a lifelong member and rider with the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club. And Callum raced many different kinds of motorcycles down the years, including this 4-stroke Husqvarna, and of course also his little CR250 Honda as well. But he'll certainly be sadly missed by everyone involved in the club, and it goes without saying that myself and everyone else that knew Callum send our best wishes and thoughts to Callum's family at this very sad time. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed taking a look at some of those very nice bikes from around the paddock at this Round 3 event here at North Carnduff Farm. And don't forget, you can see all of those bikes and many more like it when we post the racing videos from this event. So if you haven't already subscribed to my YouTube channel, then I do hope you will consider doing that very small thing, because that way you won't miss out on any future videos that I post. So until the next time, from all of us here at North Carnduff Farm, it's goodbye for now.